Hello, I am here today with the first half of my November wrap-up. For those of you who have been around for a while, you will know that I'm currently doing a thing called Not the Usual November, which I will link my introduction video to that down below if you haven't seen it. But basically I have been gravitating towards books this month that I might not necessarily pick up usually, and I've also tied this in with non-fiction November because I don't usually pick up non-fiction. So I have a lot to talk to you about and I have a lot of opinions about these books. So I'm going to get straight into it. Warning, this is probably going to contain some controversial opinions and it could go into rant territory, but I'm going to try not to let it. Okay, so the first book I read this month was Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman. This won the Costa Book Awards this year, I think, or last year. And it also, apparently, according to the blurb, Gail Honeyman has also won the Observer's Debut of the Year. She was also awarded the Scottish Book Trust's Next Chapter Award when she was writing this, I think. And she was shortlisted in the past for the Bridport Prize. So she's an author who, you know, you'd think would be really worth the time, and I picked this up purely because I've heard so much about it from so many people, and it's one of those books where at the moment you can't go anywhere without seeing somebody reading it or seeing it advertised somewhere. And it's also a book that I've heard a lot about in the bookish community. It's not just a bestseller, it seems to be universally loved among book lovers. I hated this book, so I could go into a huge rant about this. Basically, the blurb for this book is that it is about a woman called Eleanor Oliphant who is a little bit socially awkward. She has trouble interacting with her colleagues. She doesn't really have that much success in building relationships, which is something I can totally get behind. Social awkwardness is my bag. However, I would say that Eleanor Oliphant is not just socially awkward. I think she's a little bit autistic. I don't know whether that's intentional. It's never expressly discussed in here. I don't know. I think Gail Honeyman was just going to create a character who is socially awkward, in which case this didn't work for me at all. Eleanor Oliphant is just a terrible character. She calls her mum Mummy, which is a big bad point for me anyway. There is sort of history there and reasons, but it turns me off straight away when a character calls their mum Mummy when they're 30 years old. Also, Eleanor Oliphant is blatantly rude to the staff members that she comes across, and to be honest, she's kind of high and mightily rude to her colleagues and everybody around her as well. I think that could have worked possibly if she was meant to be autistic. If, however, she was not meant to be autistic, it does not work for me at all. I disliked her intensely as a character. Also, this has a bookish trope of that thing where Eleanor is 30 years old. She's not a child, she's not a teenager, and this book very much has this suddenly all this stuff happened thing, and it's like Eleanor has been paused in time for the last 30 years until the start of this book, and then things suddenly start happening and her life starts changing, and it's just, ugh, I just hated this book. At 50 pages in, I was like, I'm not going to finish this, it's awful, and I was forcing myself to pick it up. Then something does happen which I think kind of adds depth to the character of Eleanor, and it does make her a little bit more understandable, but generally I just thought she was an unrealistic character. As I say, I don't know whether Gail Honeyman meant to write her as an autistic character, and that's just kind of being left out of the blurb. And also I was reading other people's reviews and they were all just saying, oh, this is such a fantastic depiction of someone who's awkward socially. No, it's not. If she was meant to be autistic, I can see why that would work, but also I would say there are much better books about autistic people out there. The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, The Rosie Project even, and J.D. Piccolo's book, House Rules, is really good in that respect. This book, I just felt, I didn't really understand what it was. I think it was marketed in completely the wrong way, and also I just didn't like it. It very much, as I say, it was like Eleanor had been paused in time for 30 years and suddenly the book happened and everything was hunky-dory. I also don't like books which are kind of too positive, I guess, and too sickly sweet, and this was that for me in the end. I just, not for me at all. I do not get the hype. I don't get the fact that it's had all these awards. I just don't understand it. Then a positive note, I read The Trip to Echo Springs by Olivia Lang. Now this was a bit of a cheat because this is a book that I've wanted to pick up for a very long time. However, it's a non-fiction book, which, as I say, I don't usually pick up, so I thought I could include that here. This is basically Olivia Lang's exploration into famous writers of the past and why they drink and why they are more sort of predisposed to things like alcoholism. Basically looks at a few main figures. So she looks a lot at Tennessee Williams, a lot at F. Scott Fitzgerald, Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway, and she also discusses some other people that I didn't know that much about, and also Raymond Carver in the end a little bit. And she does this as she is kind of travelling around America and going and visiting places that meant things to these people, or bars that they drank in a lot, and in the meantime she sort of explores their lives. I really enjoyed this. I think it was a book that I was going to enjoy. Olivia Laing is the author of The Lonely City, which I absolutely loved and was one of my favourite books a few years ago. So I knew I was going to like this, and it's about writers and drinking. Things that I generally knew I would find interesting. The only thing I would say with this is that a few people have said they preferred this to The Lonely City. I would not say that. I would actually say the two books are quite similar in terms of the fact that they look at artists and the lives of artists and the loneliness of artists. Because loneliness does crop up here as well, I would say that probably The Lonely City is like a development of this book. It's a strangely written book at times. I mean, I like the fact that Olivia puts herself in there with her journeying through America, but there are times when she's talking about her journey through America and she'll randomly report a piece of speech that she hears, and it doesn't have any real relation to the story. I also found at times that she kind of wrote about these writers as though she was there when it's stuff that she has no way of really knowing. So there are some strange stylistic choices in here, and I would definitely say The Lonely City is a much more realised book, which surprised me because a lot of the artists in The Lonely City I didn't know about, whereas I knew about and love most of the artists and writers who are discussed in here. But I would still recommend this. It was interesting and worth a read, and if you like the writers who are discussed, I think you will find something to enjoy in here. Then another book I just don't get, and that is The Essex Fan by Sarah Perry. Now, I'm going to be honest, I'm really disappointed by this. This is a book that I picked up this month because it's historical fiction, and I don't typically read historical fiction, but I was really thinking that I was going to enjoy this. I've had it on my shelf for so long, and I've been saving it for a sort of dark and dreary day and thinking that I would get absolutely stuck in and adore it, and I kind of hated it. I'm not going to lie, it ended up being 2 stars for me. That was generous, but again, this is a book that has such wide love. It's been Waterstone's Book of the Year. It's everywhere. There are posters for it everywhere. People love it. I've never heard a bad review about this book. However, there were a lot of things that I didn't like about this. Now, I will say, I think Sarah Perry, all the things that I didn't like have been intentionally done to mimic the Victorian style, and I get that. And I think if you really love Victorian novels, you'll probably find something to enjoy in here. But all of the efforts to be a Victorian novel are what made me not like this. So this is set in, I think it's 1893 in London, when we meet a woman called Cora whose husband has recently died, and she basically moves with her son and her kind of nanny friend person to Essex, where she is kind of starting a new life for herself and getting away from the not so positive life she had with her husband. And she kind of gets caught up in these rumours about an Essex serpent, which is kind of this mythological kind of Loch Ness-esque creature that the people of Essex are saying are causing these strange incidents. Basically just follow Cora's life and her relationships, predominantly with the Reverend in the new town that she's moved to. I think he's called Will. So the problem with this book is that, as I say, it tries to use a lot of Victorian tropes, and one of the things that it does is it tries to jump around in point of view a lot. And I didn't actually realise this when I first started reading it. I just knew that I wasn't captivated at all. Like, my mind was continually wandering. I didn't feel attached to the story or the characters. Pages were going by and I was just realising that I was zoning out. And that is because she jumps point of view so much, like literally within paragraphs she will jump point of view. And personally, that is a big bugbear for me. I can't stand it when authors play around with point of view, because it's kind of, there's a general rule in writing that you don't switch point of view in the same paragraph, and it's because it makes it difficult to follow. It makes it choppy, it makes it hard to connect with the characters or the story, and that's very much what I found in here. Also, Sarah Perry tries to make use of letters, because that is a trope that is often used within Victorian literature. However, I thought that in the end she kind of just used the letters in place of characterisation. So the relationship between Cora and Will, for instance, it's kind of not developed in the story. It's developed in letters, but it's just a bit lazy, and it didn't come across to me. I didn't feel invested in their relationship, and ultimately This is a kind of nicely written book, but I felt like it was a bit overwritten, again, possibly because it was trying to be Victorian, but there were times, for instance, when you could see that a piece of writing should have been beautiful, but it was kind of just like a flat song. I think that's the best way I can describe this book. It's like a song that someone is singing that has a beautiful tune and a melody, but the singing is flat, so you can't fully enjoy it. I don't know why I felt that way, but I just did. The writing and the word choices at times, and also the fact that a lot of the time characters would say things that just didn't have any meaning, and you would reread it and think, have I missed something in that sentence? And literally it would just be a pointless, meaningless sentence. And it's harsh, but I feel like that's kind of sums up this book really. I felt like ultimately there was no story, there was no real development, there was no, I don't know, there were kind of two endings as well, which didn't really make sense. I just didn't enjoy it, and it was a huge disappointment. While with Eleanor Oliphant I wasn't sure that I would enjoy it, I really thought I would love this, and as I say, everyone has loved it. Even the negative reviews on Goodreads are people saying, oh, it's well written, it's just not for me. I'm gonna take exception for that. I don't think it was well written. I really didn't enjoy it, sorry. Then I read some slightly better things. So I will do a disclaimer here. In my TBR for this, I said that I was going to read The Heart of the Matter by Gray and Green. I picked it up after reading The Essex Serpent and frankly feeling a bit low with my reading, and there was a lot of racist language in the first chapters, and I put it to the side and I'm not going to be revisiting that one. So I thought I would just discuss that here because it was in my TBR, and I think it's worth mentioning that, yeah, I'm not going to be revisiting that. So then I picked up some books that aren't on my TBR. One was A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. This is a bit of a cheat because it's not a non-November read, but I just kind of needed something after negative books, and also it's very thin, and I wanted to read this for research for my novel. This doesn't really need any introduction. It's Anthony Burgess' kind of most famous work, and it's a real classic. It looks at Alex, and he is kind of a young hooligan, and he ends up getting caught by the police and used in this new project they're using to kind of rehabilitate violent people by making them incapable of acting out violent things. This is a really good book. I think that the use of language is fantastic. The language is very unique. I'm sure you've all heard the sayings, things like droogs and ultra-violence, they come from this book. At first it's quite difficult to understand because Alex literally does use different words for everything. So let me read you a bit at the start. What's it going to be then, eh? That was me. That is Alex and my three droogs. That is Pete, Georgie and Dim. Dim being really dim. And we sat in the Crover Milk Bar making up our Azadooks, what to do with the evening. A flip dark till winter bastard through dry. The Crover Milk Bar was a milk plus mesto, and you may, oh my brothers, have forgotten what these mestos were like. Things changing so scorry these days and everybody very quick to forget. Newspapers not being read neither. Well, what they sold there was milk plus something else. They had no licence for selling liquor, but there was no law yet against prodding some of the new veshes which they used to put into the old Moloko, so you could peat it with Velicet or sint them Draincrom or one or two other veshes, which would give you a nice, quiet horror show, 15 minutes admiring Bog and all his holy angels and saints in your left shoe with light bursting all over your mozzog. So it sounds really bizarre, but actually you really get to know the language and you really get to understand without strictly understanding what he's saying. And I think the language in this alone makes it worth reading. I think it's a really interesting book in terms of writing and style. It's also interesting there's an introduction in here, which I haven't read before, which talks about how Anthony Burgess developed that language, which is basically by marrying Russian words with English language, which is really interesting. And also it talks about the fact that the American version of this book was published without the last chapter. And actually I kind of agree with that. I think it works better without the last chapter, but then I'm quite a bleak person, and I think Anthony Burgess's argument was that he needed his character to have developed in some way, which wouldn't have happened, admittedly, if they'd left out the last chapter. But yeah, it was interesting, and I would say if you haven't read this, definitely give it a go. It's one of those classics that you just should read. And then finally I bought a poetry collection yesterday thinking that I could read it for this, and finished it last night, and that is Undying, a love story by Michelle Faber. This is the poetry collection that Michelle Faber wrote in the lead up and aftermath of his wife Evie's death after cancer, and I've wanted to pick this up for a while because I read a long time ago wrote the book of Strange New Things, without knowing anything about Michel Faber, and have since learned that he wrote the Book of Strange New Things as Eva was dying, as a sort of last testament to her. And I think knowing that, my feelings for that book have changed a lot, and I want to revisit that book with that in mind. But this also intrigued me, and I'm not a poetry person. If you've been around for a while, you know I'm not at all a poetry person. I think I've probably read one complete poetry collection in my life, so this is really out of the cuff for me, but I thoroughly enjoyed this. Now, I have to be honest, I don't know from a poetic point of view whether this is a good poetry collection. I don't really know. I think the fact that I enjoyed it is possibly testament to the fact that it's more verging on prose than poetry. However, it was just divine. There are so many wonderful poems in here, and I think it's heartbreaking. Obviously, as you would expect. I also liked this, that it is put in chronological order, so not of when Michel wrote the poems, where they came in his wife's progression of her illness. So we have the sort of before and after steps, and we start with the diagnosis and then move through like that. And so I found it really good to just sit down for a few hours and read this from cover to cover, which is not something that I often find I can do with poetry books, and I think that's where we have issues. So if you're new to poetry, I would really recommend giving this a go. It's not an easy read, it's really fraught and difficult at times, but it's so good. To prove the point, I wanted to read to you my favourite poem of the lot, really. So it's called Don't Hesitate to Ask. So many of the people I've informed that she is dead have said, if there's anything we can do, anything at all, don't hesitate to ask. Well, actually, since you offer, yes. Would you mind driving me headlong through the universe at 10 million miles an hour, scattering stars like trash cans, scorching the sky? Put your foot to the floor, right through the gate of fate, trespass galaxies, straight over black holes and supernovas to the hideout of God. Wait for me while I break down the boardroom door and drag the high and mighty fucker out of his conference with eternity, his summit on the mysteries of life, and get him to explain to me why it was so necessary to torture and humiliate and fully exterminate my wife. But no, these things I do not say, because I know that by anything at all you mean a cup of tea or a lift into town if you're going that way anyway. So good. I just can't recommend this enough, and I think I'm actually going to try more poetry collections after having read this and enjoyed it so much. So that's everything I read in the first half of the month. Sorry if this video is really long, I knew it would be because I had a lot of the things to say. Please let me know down below if you agree with my views on Eleanor Oliphant and the Essex Serpent, because I just don't get it. I just don't get it. So also let me know what you've been reading, and I will see you next time. Bye!